Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told the Associated Press that if they were to lose Bakhmut, he'll be forced to compromise with Putin. He said, quote, "Our society will feel tired. Our society will push me to have to compromise with them." He said Putin will be able to sell this victory to the West, to his society, to China, to Iran, and it will be used as leverage to seek a ceasefire deal that would involve redrawing the map. This is pretty big news. First time Zelensky has said anything like this. So why is Bakhmut the pivotal point in this war? With us now is former UN weapons inspector and author of the new book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Scott Ritter. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. And happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. I made it. One more year. One more year. Let's talk about Bakhmut. Why is this? Tell us about Bakhmut. Why is it so strategically important? Where Zelensky would say, this is the end all be all. If we lose Bakhmut, that's it. How is this any different than like Mariupol, for example?
Well, Mariupol was a coastal city that fell relatively early in the war. It was a decisive battle, but not the decisive battle. It was a battle that defined the conflict for the establishment of a land bridge connecting Crimea with Russia proper. But when Ukraine lost Mariupol, they fell back on prepared defenses that are centered on what is known as the Bakhmut Soledar complex. These are two cities, sort of twin cities, known for their salt mines. Underneath the ground, there are very deep, well-established salt mines that help provide overhead protection. You can store a lot of equipment, a lot of logistics, a lot of men, a lot of material here. And this made it a natural sort of keystone to the Ukrainian defense. This has been a battle that's been fought since May. The Bakhmut Soledar struggle has been going on since May. It's been a slow, grinding war of attrition. And the reason why it's taken on such importance is the amount of military power that both sides have brought to bear into this conflict. This is a lot like the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. Stalingrad wouldn't have been the battle that it was if the Germans had simply bypassed the city and moved on. And if the Soviets had decided we're not going to defend it to the death, we're just going to continue to withdraw. But because the Soviets dug in, the Germans committed, it became one of the decisive battles of the war. Bakhmut, right now, we have 80,000 Ukrainian soldiers committed to this fight. 80,000. And what Volodymyr Zelensky is saying is when they lose this battle, and Kim, they're going to lose this battle. They're losing it as we speak. They will lose 80,000 men. And when that happens, the Ukrainian army is gutted. There's nothing left. And they are a defeated army and a defeated nation. And Zelensky has long said, you've heard him say, we're going to dictate terms of surrender to the Russians. We're going to insist the Russians leave Crimea, leave the Donbass, leave Zaporizhia, leave Kherson. We're going to have a counterattack. There will be no counteroffensive. Why? Because the entire Ukrainian, the major proportion of the Ukrainian offensive power is committed to the Bakhmut battle. They're all going to die. The equipment is going to be destroyed. And when that happens, Zelensky will have to surrender. And that's what he's saying. He's going to have to accept terms of surrender that forever redraw the map of Ukraine, that these four territories that Russia annexed back in September, plus Crimea, will forever be Russia. And there's a lot of other things that will go on too, such as Zelensky's going to have to cede some constitutional issues dealing with denazification. His military will have to be gutted. All of the NATO equipment that we've been providing will have to be either destroyed, turned over to the Russians, or returned to NATO. This is a strategic defeat of Ukraine because Zelensky made Bakhmut the strategic battle of the war.
Why do you think he did that? Why would he put all of his eggs into this one basket?
Zelensky is not a general. Zelensky is a salesman.
But he has generals, right? I mean, the generals would have told him, maybe this isn't a good idea, spread them out,
the, apparently the generals have told them this isn't a good idea. We need to do a proper distribution of our troops on the battlefield. We need to fight a more delaying action. We need to be willing to trade space for lives, to save lives, to preserve our strength so that they could carry out a potential counteroffensive that everybody's been talking about. But Zelensky's job um, is to keep the West interested in this war, keep the West providing him with assistance, not just military assistance, but remember, the entire Ukrainian economy is dependent upon foreign assistance, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars and euros pouring in. If the West believes that Ukraine is losing the conflict, and the perception of a Ukrainian defeat would be obvious if they continue to retreat, to withdraw, to trade space for time, to preserve manpower. The West would say, then why are we continuing to give you weapons? If we give you weapons, we want results. So Zelensky said, the result I want is a victory at BAKHMUT, and he's poured everything into that. And if he loses, he will have lost face, the West will have lost confidence, and he will be compelled to basically agree to whatever terms the Russians put on the table.
This is just so odd to me. The entire rhetoric throughout this entire war has been, we're not stopping until we gain back Donbass and Crimea. We're going to keep pushing. The narrative from the Western nations has been, we're not going to stop arming you until we push Russia back. We can't afford to lose this war. It just seems to be a sudden about face to say, okay, well then let's just put everybody in one spot so that they could be slaughtered by the Russians in one place at the same time. And then what? And then when that happens, then we have to concede the war, redraw the map, and Russia wins, or Russia will be able to sell this as a win. This just seems like such a shift. I can't wrap my mind around it except to think that this entire time, I mean, what many of us have suspected is that Zelensky's really just a puppet of the West, that he's on orders from whatever Western nations want, that he's not really operating on the behalf of his or in the best interest of his country, or maybe even what he wants himself. He might be, who knows? Like, I've thought maybe he's feeling threatened. Maybe there's some Western leaders that say, do it or else, you're the guy that we have set up for this position. So now for him to suddenly shift, it makes me think the West is shifting, and the West is saying to Zelensky, it's over now. People are tired. Our populations aren't wanting to fund this anymore. We're shifting to China. We don't want to have to give any more resources to you. And so you have to end this somehow, some way, and Bakhmut's the way to do it. I mean, otherwise, this doesn't make sense to me.
Well, Kim, the West hasn't gotten this war right from the very beginning. Let me give you a quick example. The Russians have called this a special military operation. There are many people in the West that say you can't use that term because you're buying into Putin's language. It's an invasion, and they say that for political reasons. No, it was a special military operation. If this was an invasion, the war would already be over. Ukraine would be destroyed. Zelensky would be dead. That's what happens when you invade. A special military operation was designed to get Ukraine to the negotiating table. Russia never wanted this war. Russia didn't want this outcome, and when they were compelled to intervene militarily, they wanted the quickest possible resolution to this conflict, a negotiated settlement. And remember, on 1 April in Istanbul, Russia was ready to sign a peace treaty that would have allowed Ukraine to retain Zaporizhia, Kherson, their dignity, hundreds of thousands of lives, tens of millions of refugees. None of this would have happened, but the West stopped it because we thought Russia was weak. We misunderstood the Russian approach towards a negotiated settlement. And since that time, we've been trying to convince ourselves that Russia can't win this war, that Russia is weak. And we've failed to recognize the reality of Russia, which is they are a very powerful country. They mobilized in September, and they're on the verge of winning this war. They were always going to win this war. There was never going to be another outcome than this. The West has been deceiving itself and has been betraying Ukraine because we have been using Ukraine as a proxy. And as a result, 300,000+ Ukrainian soldiers are dead. By the time the Battle of Bakhmut is finished, it'll be closer to 400,000. By the time this war is over, it'll be closer to 500,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. The blood isn't just on Zelensky's hands, it's on every Western leader who pressured him to keep this war going.
Why don't you think he just surrenders now rather than lose all of these 80,000 troops in Bakhmut? I mean, why sacrifice their lives if you know the outcome already?
Because he has deceived himself and he has been deceived by the West for so long. I think at the end of the day, it's like a drowning person in the ocean treading water. Why do you continue to tread water when there's no rescue vessel in sight? Because you're hoping if you could just hold out a little bit longer, a miracle will occur. There is no miracle coming for Ukraine. That's the tragedy. But Zelensky is going to hold out for a miracle, hoping the West changes its mind, provides him with the aircraft he claims he needs, provides him with more modern tanks, provides him with everything that will save him. The West isn't going to do it. The West is exhausted. The West is out of money. The West is out of materiel. And the West is just frankly done with this war.
One thing Zelensky also said to the Associated Press is if he will feel some blood, smell that we are weak, so he's talking about Putin, if he will feel some blood, smell that we are weak, he will push, push, push. This has kind of been the narrative, I think, from the West the entire time, that we must stop Russia, because if we don't stop Russia here, they're going to keep on expanding, that Putin has a desire to reunite the USSR, to reinvigorate it. I mean, is there any truth to that? Do you think that there's any possibility that even if Ukraine does say, okay, fine, we surrender, we're going to give you the land, you can have the areas that you've already occupied, that you've annexed essentially during this war, is there a possibility that Russia continues forward at some point?
You're familiar with Ray McGovern, the former CIA officer who's been outspoken on this issue. A very good intelligence officer and a mentor of mine. He's taught me a lot of things. And one of the things he taught me about dealing with the Soviet Union and Russia is to listen what the Russian leaders say. They're not Western political leaders. They don't habitually lie. When they speak in public, they tend to say what they mean, and they mean what they say. Vladimir Putin addressed the Russian people on February 21st of this year. At that time, he said the goal and objective of the conflict in Ukraine was to improve the economic and social life of the Russian citizens who lived in Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the Donbass, the four territories. He made no mention of further territorial acquisition or ambition. He simply wants to bring peace to the Russian people. That's what his objective has always been, and that's what it will continue to be. It's a lie to say that Vladimir Putin and Russia is seeking to flex their muscles. They didn't start this war. This war was thrust upon them. They are going to finish this war, but when they finish this war, they will be satisfied with bringing a higher quality of life to all Russian citizens, including the newly minted citizens of territory. Ukraine will not be under threat if Ukraine promises not to threaten Russia. Remember, it was Ukraine that decided they wanted to join NATO. It was Ukraine that allowed NATO to rebuild their army to threaten the Donbass to kill Russians. It was Ukraine that shelled Russian civilians in the Donbass, killing hundreds of children, thousands of civilians. Russia sought peace before this war. They sought peace during this war, and they're seeking peace now, but it will be peace on their terms. There is no intention on the part of Russia to do anything that Zelensky or anybody else has said. This is part of the Zelensky tactic of instilling fear in the West so that they continue to support his conflict against Russia in Ukraine. It's a failed theory, a failed strategy, because the West no longer believes that Ukraine can prevail in this conflict.
So one of the non-negotiables, do you think, will be that Ukraine has to completely, and Putin has mentioned this, demilitarize by getting rid of all of NATO weapons from Ukraine, pushing them all the way out of the nation, and halting any sort of discussion about Ukraine joining NATO? Is that something that is definitely in the cards, or will they just say, okay, we'll just stop, we'll annex this land, and and that's it?
Well, they've already annexed the land under the Russian Constitution. The Russian Constitution has been amended to recognize these territories as part of Russia. That will never change, ever. And the reason why I say that is Russia is a nuclear power, and its nuclear weapons will be used to preserve the integrity of Russia. And it doesn't matter what the West thinks. If the West thinks they're going to get Crimea back, understand that if they succeeded in that, it would be a thermonuclear war that would end all life on planet Earth. So it's ludicrous for the West of talking about reclaiming territories. But that's all Russia wants, are the Russian territories. There will be demilitarization. Demilitarization will be the denatofying of the Ukrainian military. All the billions of dollars of equipment that we've provided will either be surrendered to Russia, will be destroyed by the Ukrainians, or removed. That is a prerequisite. It's not that talk about NATO will be put on hold. It will never happen. Ukraine will commit in writing that they will never be a member of NATO. That requires a constitutional change. Denazification is another demand. It will require Ukraine to have constitutional amendments that make the worship of Stepan Bandera, this odious neo-Nazi figure from history, illegal. They will outlaw Banderism just like Germany outlawed Adolf Hitler and Nazi ideology. That will be denazification. The Ukrainian military will also be compelled to withdraw a distance of around 100, 150 kilometers away from the Russian border, creating a demilitarized zone, because Russia will never again give Ukraine the opportunity to fire an artillery shell against a Russian civilian target on Russian territory. These will be the demands, and if Zelensky doesn't agree to these demands, then Russia will destroy Ukraine. That's just a given.
So I understand that a lot of this argument for the war has been because of NATO going right up to Russia's borders, but NATO is already on Russia's borders with Estonia and Latvia. And if Finland, which is on its way to joining NATO, joins NATO, what is the argument then when you've still got a border between Russia and these NATO nations? And even if they've already annexed this land in Ukraine, so that is now effectively Russia. On the other side of that line is still Ukraine, right? I mean, you still have Ukraine, and so what? How do we then? What would be the fate then? I would say of Finland and Latvia and Estonia, if the goal is to de-NATO the border, too late. I mean, the NATO's already there.
No, that's true. First of all, there's a difference between Finland and Ukraine. Ukraine is a Slavic nation with a deep history, a cultural, religious, ethnic, language with Russia. So, the Russians feel that Ukraine is an extension of Russia, even if Ukraine is going to be an independent sovereign state. The fact of the matter is, millions of Ukrainians live in Russia. Millions of Ukrainian families are dual Russian-Ukrainian families. There's a linkage there that the West doesn't understand why Ukraine is so important. Finland made a fatal error. Russia's not going to invade Finland, but now Finland has to deal with the fact that one of the consequences of joining NATO is that Russia is building a 70,000-man corps that's going to be stationed on the Finnish border, threatening Karelia, threatening Helsinki. Welcome to the club, Finland. Not only that, every Finnish city now is targeted by Russian nuclear weapons. Welcome to the club, Finland. And if Finland seeks to put NATO infrastructure on its borders, then Russia will double the ante. Finland went from being a prosperous, neutral country to a nation that now has been compelled to spend billions of dollars on a defense that they didn't need to have because Russia never posed a threat to them. That's the reality. The Baltic states, they've joined NATO. Now, the other thing is they are all protected under Article 5. So Russia's not going to attack them because an attack against one is an attack against all. But they're also all condemned to death if NATO ever engages in a war with Russia, because now they're part of the NATO target. It was foolish on the part of Finland, and I can guarantee you within a span of less than 5 years, they will regret forever making this decision.
Yeah, but then that exact same logic would make, that's why Ukraine is saying, well, we want to join NATO, because then Russia would have that same feeling toward Ukraine that's in NATO as they do towards Estonia or Latvia, right? So
yes, but Ukraine is not Finland. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and if you take a look at the way Ukraine was created, it was literally an artificial state created by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in pursuit of a nationality policy that was as artificial as the day is long. Every Russian knows the truth that historically Ukraine is part of Greater Russia, and Russia will never allow Ukraine to be stripped away from its sphere of influence and transferred to the West. Yeah. Finland at one time was part of the Russian Empire, but from the Soviet experience, Finland was an independent nation. And so there's not that feeling of cultural betrayal, ethnic betrayal. But no, there's a huge difference between Ukraine and Finland. And people who have studied Russia understand exactly why Russia will never allow Ukraine to be part of NATO.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting that Zelensky's making these comments. I mean, we might just be seeing the end of this conflict pretty shortly if what he's saying is accurate. If they do feel like it's time to go to the table over Bakhmut, that very interesting. So many of us wondered when this would end, and we might just actually be seeing it. Scott, tell us about your book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. This just came out a few months ago. What is this about?
Well, it's about the implementation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. That's the landmark arms control agreement that was signed by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. Um, I happened to be one of the first inspectors assigned to the INF Treaty, and I actually was one of the first inspectors on the ground in the Soviet Union when the treaty implementation phase began. It tells the story of how we built from nothing a multi-million dollar monitoring facility outside of a Soviet ballistic missile factory and the implementation that went there. It talks about how we broke down the walls of fear and hatred and actually started working together as colleagues and friends with our Soviet counterparts to make the world a safer place. I call it not just a work of history, but a template of hope, because today, when we take a look at the current relationships between the United States and Russia, they're just as bad as they were in the 1980s. And yet we found a way in the 1980s through the implementation of meaningful arms control to reduce tensions and make the world a safer place and improve relations. And I believe that's the key for moving forward today with Russia. Arms control, meaningful arms control, real arms control.
Scott, thank you so much for your insight, and thank you for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.